Um, Welcome everybody to this LSE event hosted by the European Institute. My name is Paul de Grauwe. I am the John Paulson Chair in European Political Economy at the LSE European Institute. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight, joined by Paolo Guerrieri and Pier Carlo Padoan, who is sitting there, and our discussions that I will introduce in a minute. To launch the book Sovereign Europe, an agenda for Europe in a fragmented global economy. So I will introduce the speakers in a minute. First a number of practical notes that I want to formulate. So please put your phones in silent mode so as not to disrupt the event. I also would like to let you know that the event is being recorded and will be made available as a podcast later. There will be a possibility to ask questions afterwards. For the online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and please include your name and affiliation. And for those who are here in the theater, I will let you know when we open the floor, and then you just raise your hand and somebody will come up with the microphone to get you, and please also let us know your name and affiliation. For the Twitter users, ex-users, I should say, I guess, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSEEI. So this is about the book that has been written by Paolo and Pier Carlo, Sovereign Europe, an agenda for Europe in a fragmented global economy. It couldn't be more topical as we are now in a time where all the cooperative features that have been built up in the post-war period and that were actually at the source of the great increase in welfare, this is now put into question. And this book is actually starting from that problem and then trying to point out how we can, at the European level, come to a new way of organizing cooperation so as to deal with public goods and to deal with externalities. And these are the reasons why actually we want to do cooperation. So let me now introduce the speakers of tonight. We first have Paolo Guerrieri, who is a visiting professor at the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po in Paris, and the Business School of the University of San Diego. Paolo was also a senator of the Italian Republic, a member of the Economic Budget Committee and the European Policy Committee at the Italian Senate from 2013 to 2018. I'm sure he did many more things, but I will stop here.
Thank you.
Pier Carlo Padoan also has an illustrious career. He's now chairman of UniCredit since April 2020. And as you know, he's on a buying spree of
Yes.
German banks.
Not only, actually.
No comment.
He was the Italian Minister of Economy and Finance from February 2014 to May 2018, and Member of Parliament from 2018 to 2020. He was also Chief Economist at the OECD in Paris, right? Then our first discussant will be Tony Barber, who's the European comment editor of the Financial Times. He's a former foreign correspondent in a number of countries, starting with small countries first, Austria, Belgium, then raising the stakes, going to Germany, Italy, Poland, and the former Soviet Union, the US, but then back to Yugoslavia, if I may say so. So he's a well-known commentator from the Financial Times, and we are very happy to have him here, and as well the other members of the panel of commentators. Ian Beck, who's sitting next to me, is a professorial research fellow at the LSE European Institute and has been very active in very important issues, policy issues of the European Union and the Eurozone. Lorenzo Codogno is a visiting professor in practice at the LSE European Institute and also combines practical experience and academic knowledge. And then finally, last but not least, Leila Simone Talani is professor of international political economy and director of the Center for Italian Politics in the Department of European International Studies at King's College London, a neighbor of us.
A neighbor, a neighbor.
So we are very pleased to have you here. And now I would like to give the floor to Paolo. 15 minutes, Paolo.
Is on? Okay. Thank you very much, Paul, for his introduction. Nice words about the book. And so I will try very briefly to summarize what is the content of the book. And just to start, you know, the inspirational motive of our book can be summed up in a nutshell by a very clear statement. The world has radically changed over the past decade, at least. Europe must change. It must change in order to adapt to it. That was the kind of main inspiration. About the radical change of the world economy, one could say that the past international order is being turned upside down. Some unifying structural trends, such as rising global trade and financial integration, are today being undermined by fragmentation. Even interdependence has become not only a source of opportunities, but more and more a source of threats, this so-called weaponized interdependence. And the imposition of President Donald Trump of a steep tariff very recently on Canada, Mexico, and China, we think marks the most recent escalation in this process. Now, in this new fragmented world, Europe has become more vulnerable, both economically and strategically. In a world where economic and security are more and more closely intertwined, the European economic model that was very successful, but was based on, ingredient like cheap energy from Russia, medium technology, industrial product, export grew led by China and the rest of the world. These ingredients, these components are today not at all available. So this model is in crisis. And in the face of all that, Europe cannot simply seek to stabilize. Europe must seek change and should change fast. Now, the only effective way for this kind of change is that of a more integrated European Union, at least in some areas and on some issues. And in our book, we try to identify some key areas where European collective action could benefit all member states, just because no European country can go it alone. And these areas are fundamental kind of sector like energy, digital technology, telecom, finance, or defense industry. These are all sectors in which European countries have lagged behind and are now in great difficulty, mostly because they have been still are fragmented. And there is no any European internal market, or internal market has not yet been completed in this area. So in this area, achieving European sovereignty is the only effective way forward. And European sovereignty will not weaken national identity, but on the contrary, it will strengthen it, because it's going to allow European countries to have a voice and a presence where, if they go alone individually, they would end up continuing for nothing, totally marginalized. So the European option, that is our, kind of main message, remain the best kind of option. And we try to demonstrate in our book, by pointing out that Europe can avoid its own economic decline starting in the next 5 years by fulfilling at least 3 basic conditions. The first one is at the domestic level, restoring prosperity and growth by using the Green Deal also for industrial renewal in order to restart the European growth engine. But of course, it's necessary to deeply, revise the strategy adopted so far on a Green Deal. And particularly, one should succeed in combining environmental policy and industrial policy. And we, in the book, trying to highlight 3 directions in order to revise this Green Deal policy. The first one, we need more investment in clean technology and a common industrial policy to create new clean jobs. In other words, much more positive kind of direction than just regulation and trying to restrain. Second, we need a great sharing and a much fair distribution of the cost of the transition, because these costs are asymmetrically distributed, and they fall relatively more on the poorer classes and on a marginalized company and sector. And a third, of course, we need massive common financing because all this transition will cost a lot of money. So this is the first, kind of a goal that we think is a fundamental in order to stop and trying to revert the decline. The second condition at the international level, a more ambitious and autonomous international presence for the European Union is another major priority for the coming years. Openness, for Europe is a kind of necessity because Europe is the most open of the major area, and its growth requires a world economy that remain, open as much as possible, of course, taking into account of the new geopolitical and security factors. So, foreign economic policy is important. In other words, Europe require alliances and partnerships with countries that share the same interest in maintaining as much as possible an open system. It followed that the Union cannot rely only on trade policy, as it happened over the past at least 20 years. It must focus on economic security, on investment policy, and on development cooperation, because that is the kind of instruments that you need to form these new alliances. So for this kind of view, you try to, in some way, show how it's possible to have a foreign economic policy toward China or many countries of the global south, and particular African countries are indeed very important in this kind of development policy of Europe. So this is the second dimension, a more ambitious and autonomous international presence. And the third, of course, is in light of all these new challenges, Europe as a governance system is currently structured that is not up to the task. The governance system needs, to be profoundly restructured and renewed. And firstly, common resources must be secured to finance all the necessary huge investment. And we know, how important is to complete the internal market, for example, in terms of a financial market, unifying the capital market and forming what is called a saving investment union is by all means a crucial step, even if, the first tangible result will come only in the medium term. But of course, other sources of financing are also needed, particularly to finance public investment. Because from this point of view, for example, the experience we had with the common European debt to the program like Next Generation EU, and sure, this kind of experience, are essential road to take, particularly, to fund spending on large-scale European public goods assets. And it's very well known, like ecological transition, defense, technological change are from this point of view, this kind of very important European public good. But of course, common resources are important, but also the tools of governments must change. The criteria by which decisions are reached in the EU are not at all, adequate to face the new challenge. The unanimity rule, just to make one, major example, no longer works. So, this is the third area where we try in the book to depict what the kind of change are needed. So, to summarize, Europe can prevent its own economic decline starting for the next 5 years by meeting these three conditions: revitalizing growth and prosperity through the Green Industrial Deal, asserting its own greater global role, making more effective choice and policies, and financing them, faster and through a strengthened governance. Of course, all these require a change, of course, a market discontinuity in terms of the policy and tools to be used. But what we're trying to show in the book, that solutions are possible, solutions do exist. But of course, that does not mean they will be implemented. Looking to the next year, one could mention two particular obstacles, and I'm going to conclude with these two particular obstacles to be overcome. The first obstacle is internal. In other words, relate to the division now existing in the EU between forces and parties that are in favor of a policy of greater integration at a European level, such the one we outline in the book, and the other, part, the right-wing, more or less radical political party and movement in Europe, including in Italy, which advocate instead a national response to global challenge. The major goal of this force is returning many policy and instrument of intervention from the European to the national level. And from this point of view, they are not anymore, in some way, advocating any kind of exit, because after UK and Brexit, no more country want to in some way experience this kind of outcome, but they trying to in some way to do something from inside Europe, trying to in this reintroducing in a national level this common policy, trying to weaken the kind of European Union. The second obstacle, of course, comes from the new Trump administration. During the first one, Trump's relations with Europe were turbulent, to say the least. His second administration might bring even more negative consequences, with economic policy and choices openly conflicting with Europe in areas like climate and energy, trade, relation with China, and even issue of defense and the expense of supporting it. We had these 2 weeks, barely 2 weeks into the new presidency, we already seeing an incredible broad front of confrontational challenge launched by Trump. In this regard, the European Union is in great danger because it's still looking to an old order that no longer exists. And instead, we need to establish a transactional relationship with a new Trump administration. And in other words, we should prepare for a world in which power is more important than rules. And of course, as Pascal Lamy has said, Europe cannot remain an herbivorous power in a world of carnivores, So the fork in the road is now clear. Either Europe will be able to help shape the new international order by negotiating a positive agenda with Washington and China, not just trade retaliation, or Europe is going to become a marginal actor. A future developments at international level will be largely determined elsewhere than Europe, and notably by the competitive relation between the US and China. This is, the most important kind of alarming kind of a future that we should be fully aware of being able to challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo, for this very concise statement of the problem that we face today. So we will now have a session of discussions, 4 discussions, who will first formulate their questions, objections, comments, and then there will be an interaction. All this will take about half an hour. And after that, Pier Carlo, you will then take over for a final statement, right? So I propose, Tony, you start first.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very positive sounding picture that you portray of what could be done if things go well. You touched on some of the potential obstacles near the end, and I think this is really what everyone in this room is sort of asking themselves, isn't it? Will the politics get in the way and just prevent any of this happening? As I see it, you can kind of break down the potential political obstacles into 3 categories. You mentioned the new Trump administration, and I would put it sort of the first category a bit more broadly in kind of the external world, the non-European world, the way things can happen unexpectedly or in ways that Europe, doesn't like or is fearful of. So apart from the Trump administration, one could point without any question to Russia on the eastern border. One could point to certain things that China gets up to. One could point to instability and the role of strongmen rulers in North Africa and the migration problem and so on. So there's these external factors collectively often can be a drag on an ineffective common European performance. The second category of political obstacle, as I see it, is when you get the 27 EU national governments around one table to try and reach a common position on things. And here, one could point to issues ranging from trade, the recent Mercosur debates with South America. One could point without any question, every time the subjects of migration and refugees comes up, highly divisive. One could point to foreign policy more generally, and although perhaps the thing on our minds might be Ukraine, but if you look at Gaza, I mean, it's split national governments in the EU right down the middle. And if you consider, for example, the support from countries like the Czech Republic for Israel on the one hand, and at the opposite end of the picture, Spain for the Palestinians. So the budget, the long-term EU budget, another very divisive one. So in other words, getting a coherent response from the national governments around is also difficult. The third category, though, I think is the really, really important one, and you did touch on it just at the end there, and that is that a lot of these disputes feed into and reflect divisions inside the national politics of each country. And this is the real heart of the problem, I think, because it means that because of their democracies, in the search for votes and effective coalitions to rule the country, endless short-term concessions or compromises or bids for votes are made by parties in a way that don't actually bode well for a coherent pan-European response. And one only has to look at what the CDU leader Friedrich Merz was up to in Germany last week to see it. But you get that replicated all the time in the national politics of each country. And it's a kind of genie that's got out of the bottle about maybe 25 years ago. It's really since the referendums on the doomed constitutional treaty at the beginning of this century. I think all these EU issues are now up for debate at national level in the way that they weren't. They are divisive, and parties, not just hard right or radical right ones, but really everyone sees a way of kind of maneuvering around on these subjects for domestic political advantage. And I think this is one of the reasons why it gets harder than it used to be a generation ago to get quick, effective action at the EU stage. I think I'll leave it at that because I guess I'm pretty close to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Lorenzo.
Okay, so thank you, Paul. I will kickstart with a quote, which is certainly not very close to the feeling of Pier Carlo and Paolo. It comes from Suella Braverman, okay, and a former Home Secretary here in the UK. And he once addressed some protesters saying, Guardian reading, tofu eating, wokerati. Okay, so I think I have no idea whether Paolo or Pier Carlo read The Guardian or eat tofu, but probably they don't mind being called wokerati. If by wokerati we mean mainstream economists, very much in line with the consensus view in Brussels to some extent, and actually if we mean wokerati as people that care, they care in trying to combine social issue, political issues, and difficult things that can sometimes is simply very challenging to bring together. So this is actually the purpose of the book. And the book is a small book. It can be read very easily, but it's very ambitious because it tries to bring together things that are sometimes very difficult to bring together. In particularly, I think they look at a very topical issue nowadays, that is the issue of complementarity of economic, geopolitical decisions. And also they argue that the current phase of development of the global system offers several possibilities of evolution, and some of them probably not very favorable. Now, in the interest of time, I can actually raise three questions. The first one is about climate change mitigation. The book says the benefits of climate change mitigation in terms of increased productivity and growth will only be available in the medium and long term, which is, of course, correct. And the risk nowadays is that the near-term costs will not be shared fairly across different nations and group of citizens, and policymakers might be faced with a very difficult trade-off between maintaining competitiveness and confirming the targets of climate transition. So climate transition plays a very important role in the book as a driver for growth. And the question is whether we should actually be, say, attentive of the situation and maybe shift a little bit the attitude going forward and make it more flexible and more in line with the compatibilities of the issues that are around us. Second question is really about another issue. The authors say that the EU, today's challenges require the EU to develop an array of policies, primarily industrial, technological, competition policies, and to introduce implementation tools for a new industrial policy that links innovation, technology, and competitiveness. So they are very much in favor of a strong role by the government in driving this. Now, I'm probably backward looking because I'm still a kind of free marketeer, okay, so a bit skeptical about the role of the government, but you know, these days things have changed dramatically, okay, so we live in a completely different world, but there are some wake-up calls, like you know, Trump the other day trying to bring together technological companies to form a sort of cartel, and then a few days later we got DeepSeek, okay, so basically challenging it. So that is. So I wonder whether really this approach is a good approach for the future in the EU. And finally, my last point. Forgot. It's here. Okay. Now the book looks at say the international political economy theory and tries to develop different phases in the development of the EU and the world. And basically says the construction of a regime, by regime means some sort of equilibrium, political equilibrium, requires a set of conditions that accompany its birth, development, maturity, and collapse. So can the advent of Trump be considered the advent of a new international order in which the inconsistent quartet is abandoned, in particular that calling for free trade, and the weaponization of tariffs might push the world into a new equilibrium, a different equilibrium, or an instability that might actually change completely the outlook. So don't want to be, say, too provocative, but the book says fragmentation factors are the reasons for leaving the regime or deciding not to participate in it. And Trump deflagrating the international system based on free trade, international institutions might really be a major challenge today. And in the framework of the book, this might indeed represent a regime shift. What do you think?
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo. Our third commentator is Ian Begg.
It's almost disturbing to recall that it is more than 3 decades since Paolo and I collaborated in an EU-funded project, first of several, well before he became a senator. Although I'm still upset with him that he never invited me for lunch in the Senate dining room in Rome. Maybe one day. I want to start by making 3 points based on a rather quick reading of the book, which I congratulate you on because it's wide-ranging. You start from antecedents in the 1960s and move on to trying to work out what's going on today. Your timing is, as always when you write a book, which is a long lead time, unfortunate because 2 significant things happened in the interim. You already mentioned Trump, but there's also the fact of Mario Draghi's report on competitiveness at European level, with the follow-on from that, including the, what's it called? The Compact for Competitiveness or something at European level, which who knows what it means. Compass, yes. Who knows what that's going to mean? It could be another example of European hot air. A second point, when I read through the book, the tone fluctuates. And I think this has already been picked up in the first set of comments by Tony, that sometimes you sound very positive, almost Ponglossian in your approach to what Europe is able to do. And then it drifts into being a bit negative and saying, well, things are not looking good. We can't really deal with this. There's all these political obstacles and so on. So this creates a little bit of uncertainty in the mind of the reader about whether your message.
On the second edition.
Ho capito. So this creates a bit of uncertainty in the mind of the reader. What your core message is? Is it positive or negative, or is it a roadmap for something? And a third, notwithstanding DeepSeek appearing last week while I was giving a talk, I looked up some numbers assembled by Forbes, the American business magazine, about AI, and specifically their list of the top 50 AI companies in the world by the amount of funding they have. 39 of the top 50 are American. 32 of the top 50 are in California. 30 of the top 50 are in the Bay Area between San Jose and San Francisco. This tells us something, because spread around the rest of the world, what do you find? You have 1 in Germany, 2 in France, including Mistral, which is by far the biggest European company, 1 in Germany, 2 in the Netherlands, 1 in Sweden, and 2 in the UK, which I'm adding into Europe for present purposes. This tells us something, because they don't count China in Forbes. tells us something is going on here about concentration of this huge new area of activity. So we need to be concerned about that and to pose a question of whether what it testifies to is a cultural problem in Europe, not wanting to take risks because of maybe the precautionary principle, as well as the standard explanation of the absence of venture capital. Something to explore there. So let me try to pin you down with 3 questions. First, you pin the growth argument quite a lot on the green transition, the Green Deal, the green aspects of Next Generation EU. And I wonder whether you should bring in a bit more, well, obviously you finished the book now, but in the second edition that Pier Carlo is talking about, bring in a bit more of the digital and some of the other things like biotech, which are on the borders of what European companies can do. Don't forget, mRNA is a European discovery, which is very much in BioNTech, the German company. Second question, and this is a much more tricky one. We're beginning to see suggestions that the German model of the last decades, how long, I don't know how long to say, is being eclipsed. And that German model consisted of a strong export orientation, relatively cheap energy, mainly coming from Russia, and American security. Now, all 3 things have moved against the Germans because China all of a sudden is the major manufacturer of the new wave of electric cars. And is this German model's challenge, I won't maybe tone it down from eclipse, something that faces the rest of Europe in a way which is going to be counter to your ideas? My third question concerns Next Generation EU, which features a lot in the book. You seem to be very positive about it, say this is a great European invention based on a new mode of financing, which is true. It's also, however, a very significant cross-border transfer with countries like Italy and many of those in Central and Eastern Europe benefiting far more than others. In other words, it's a fiscal transfer. My question is in 2 parts. Is Italy the litmus test of whether this is a good idea? And given the very immediate response of the German finance minister, who by now has left office, to the ideas from the Draghi report for having a similar fund for competitiveness purposes, which was within 3 hours, he just said 9. Is the idea of debt-financed European policies realistic? How is it going to be pushed through? You see there, I tried to start with praising the book, but then I tried to be awkward.
As usual.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. Now, Simona, last but not least, you have the floor.
Usually they say about someone who is actually least. I'm joking. So I kind of will have a little bit of an answer to one of your questions as well. Anyways, so I cannot disagree with the argument of this book because I've been educated at the LSE and Paul has been one of the major responsible for my knowledge about the monetary union and fiscal coordination, fiscal union, the need for fiscal transfer to complete the economic monetary union. So I kind of come from a certain specific tradition which believes in a way in this kind of integration of Europe. So I really do agree, even with the Next Generation EU fiscal transfer, the Euro bonds and how they can help, equilibrating or leveling a little bit some of the asymmetries of the economic and monetary union, which we don't want to discuss now. So it's not part of my intervention as well. But I have to say something in relation to the last point that Paolo made, the limits or the obstacles to the application of this that I think is a good plan. Let's be honest, I do agree on most of it. And one of them, I'm not going to talk about Trump because I had distinguished colleagues who said more interesting things than I can, but I'd like to talk a little bit about this issue of the populist radical right-wing parties and the fact that this is, I think, is a huge obstacle considering that they wouldn't agree with your plan, mostly, in particular, environmental policy, maybe defense policy, which has been portrayed as one of the ways to resolve the economic crisis and the industrial crisis of Europe, and is one of the most likely way forward for Europe, to be honest. I believe in it, although I'm not necessarily agreeing with this. But these populist radical right parties, they are definitely anti-globalization, they're nationalistic, they're xenophobic, and they wouldn't implement most of your ideas. And now I really want to move a little bit onward and just suggest something that could make you think to add another chapter to the next book, which is why don't we consider a way forward to counter this populist discourse to introduce a subject which is not talked about in the book, which is the one of migration. And I connect myself also to the question that was just made by Ian, and in particular the fact that there is one country which not only used the PNRR, the Next Generation EU funds properly, but is growing at 3.5%, which is US level of growth at the moment, and also regularize migrants. And I know you know which country I'm talking about, because you know is Spain. Spain used more or less the same amount of money from the PNRR than Italy, because they had they did it in two installments, first 95 billions and then asked for more. And they use them much more properly than Italy. Can I say it as an Italian? We can discuss it, but I think there is no debate. And actually, Italy is growing at the moment at 0%, whereas Spain is growing at 3.5%. And they also managed to regularize migrants. There is a hell of a lot of literature, with all my students here know, because we do political economy migration, that says, by not me, but serious economists at Harvard, which I personally interviewed, the migrants are actually a resource for growth. And there is what they call a trillion loan waiting at the sidewalks, which is given by the increase of the proper use of migrants, including the irregular migrants. And the World Bank has established that the migration and opening the border to migrants would increase by 150% the global GDP in the next 50 years. So my point is this. Isn't it possible to reconsider the rhetoric about migration, which is not necessarily only a problem, but could actually be a resource, especially for liberal economists like my friend Lorenzo, in a way that actually is used by the non-xenophobic, anti-populist forces or, let's say, parties, or whatever you want to call it, in Europe, to foresee a different pattern towards growth in our beloved European Union, instead of necessarily only blaming them for the fact that we don't have growth, is exactly the opposite. So my point is just, let's consider this as the next chapter of your book.
Okay, thanks. Important point. So now we will have a discussion. I propose you just reply to the comments. Or is it?
Thanks for letting me.
Oh, okay. That's fine. No, okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much to LSC for hosting this wonderful event. It's a great pleasure being here. Let me respond immediately to the fact that there are mood cycles in the book, as Ian suggested. Maybe we should do the following exercise. Ask ourselves who wrote of the two of us which book, which chapter, and see whether it's structural or cyclical factor of being happy or optimistic or pessimistic. Having said that,
I know Paolo well.
well, okay, so we'll check it later on. But first of all, before I try to answer to the very insightful questions, let me give you in a very short time what is one of the guide to the reading to the reading of the book that I suggest. The basic idea is, will Europe make it to find and implement a solution? And the answer lies in a look at the different phases through which Europe has gone since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which is the last stable global governance system, into a new system which no one governs one-sided and needs alliances and collective action to be dealt with. The idea is that when the global system collapses or weakens and gets more fragmented, or will be getting more fragmented, the reaction of Europe has been many times positive. This is one way in which I admit there is a positive vein. It's been positive, so we could accept the Monnet principle that Europe responds to crisis. And so if there is a crisis, you can expect a positive reaction. Is this too optimistic? Of course it is, especially now. We have to test in the upcoming years and months whether this principle continues to be valid, and therefore we can expect Europe to change and deepen its institutions in the way that Paolo described earlier on, in a way that a new regime, a new system of political equilibrium can be set up. From this point of view, the points one would like to, I suggest that if you ever want to go through again to the book again or for the first time, there is a sequence of big questions that have to be settled. First of all, what is a reasonable, viable, long-term strategy for Europe? Where are the resources to implement it? And most importantly, a point that which was not discussed much so far, but I invite you to consider, what are the incentives global-wide or Europe-wide to make changes needed for the new regimes to be viable? This is one aspect which the international political economy approach, which dates back in the United States a few decades ago, offers a lot of insights, which may be right or wrong. It looks at the collapse of the hegemonic system, and it asks the question, which was recalled by some of you, if we don't have an hegemon, do we have international public goods and international stability? Or we are destined not to have anything as long as the US is not willing and not able to provide public goods. If, however, we believe that we need public goods, then we have to ask the question in another fashion. Will Europe be able and willing to provide global public goods in terms of security, in terms of cooperation, in terms of open trade and absence of conflicts? So this is something which I would like you to think about and reposition the questions within this framework. Let me come now to the specific questions, and let me thank you for being so specific and so nice to us, by the way. I was expecting fierce criticism, but maybe times have changed, or I'm too old. Okay. But first of all, let me say that I share very much Simona's point that we are missing a chapter on migration. By all means, migration is good, certainly for European countries that allow migration, and it's good to some extent for countries that drive their citizens out of the country because of disgraceful conditions for living and surviving. At the same time, and this is the paradox, migration is probably the most contentious issue in public debate and political debate today in Europe, because people fail to see the benefits of migration. And even if they do see the benefits of migration, they consider the benefits being less than the costs of accepting migrants. And the conversation could go on and on for a long time, but certainly I take the point fully. And this is clearly something that characterizes the political debate in many European countries, certainly in Germany, certainly in my own country, which is now going through a phase of remarkable stability, let me say without irony. No, I'm not. No, it's not irony. It's so, that's the case. So first of all, a new chapter in the book. But before that, the question, or what do we need to do? And this was the question posed, is it green growth, green transition enough? Of course it's not enough. Green transition is something which should permeate the policy debate, but also consider how the transition is something which, including its early analysis, will provide benefits only in the medium to long term. And so there is a long phase of transition in which the cost of transition and structural change will be higher, significantly higher, which will generate, and it's already generating, short-termism in green strategy, and will weaken the incentives for these systems and policy systems and market systems to go green. Because let's not forget one fact that was also mentioned in the interventions, that the cost of going to the green transition is huge, and it's hugely larger from what even a hugely optimistic fiscal policy could provide. It's much larger than that. So we need private sector money. So that's why we need, for instance, a saving and investment union like Nicoletta suggested, because we have to mobilize resources in Europe that are available, because there is lots of savings in Europe, but which prefer to go abroad. So abroad we go and finance US investment, including in high technology, because there's no enough incentives in Europe to invest the same amount of savings I was talking about. If this trend continues, then the foreseeable future, say in the medium term, will be one of continuing decline and deindustrialization in Europe, widening technological gap between the US and Europe, and possibly economic as well as geopolitical reasons for the, unfortunately, looming conflict between China and the US to take the floor. So Europe not only will not contribute to global stability, but will also lose the opportunity of mobilizing the resources. This is the way I read Draghi's report, which is a very well-written report, which basically brings together something we already knew. This is not a criticism to Mario Draghi by all means. However, think of what it means to implement that report. Only in the first page of the report, Mario hints at the real problem. Who will kick off a process so that the resources in Europe will start remaining in Europe, being invested in technology and high tech and new general purpose technology in a way that will allow to fill the gap? This requires political leadership. This requires signal coming from governments in Europe to say, dear private sector operators, dear markets, you should look at the longer term and invest the money in these sectors which have been introduced, let's not forget it, before the COVID crisis exploded. And we can do it in a ways through which the collective action obstacles to cooperation are overcome. And I admit that I was responsible for much of the chapter on Next Generation EU. So if that is a positive chapter, I take it. This does not mean that Paolo doesn't believe in that, but sometimes he looks at me worryingly when I propose to be so optimistic. Next Generation EU, it's only part of a strategy. Next Generation EU, first of all, is a strategy which brings together all the instruments. The ambition is to be macroeconomic, public investment, structural reforms, and public financing. So it is possible, but it does not exploit all the benefits. What is missing here? A typical European point, that it's not only about national strategies, it's about European strategies. So we, in the Next Generation EU Mark V, we should have more measures aimed at exploiting the single market and exploiting scale effects, which it's an old topic. I mean, when I was a student, I was first came familiar with scale effects, but we're still there talking about the same issues because we haven't made much progress. And this you can see in the figures. The GDP per capita figures for Europe has been stagnating for a long time. If that's not stagnation, what is? I don't know. But let me finish. So why do we need institutional changes? Because to some extent, it's not a question of answering the question, does Europe have the resources? My answer is yes, it does. Is Europe using the resources in the right way? No, it's not. Why is that? Because the public policy aspect is not supporting public collective action, and the private sector is responding to short-term incentives rather than long-term incentives. So we're all stuck. In the meantime, the world is not stuck because the main threat to having management and governance of globalization is the fact that there is new variable which surprisingly, not many of you have mentioned in this conversation, and that word is security. Security now is top of the agenda, and we can have a world based on security, but this could be a very dangerous world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I bring in also a question that I had while listening to you, and also at a certain moment what Ian was saying about debt finance. So your analysis is that there was a saving surplus in Europe, right? And it's not channeled towards investment in Europe, but mostly outside, like in the US. Shouldn't the public authorities, not only European, but also national authorities, take that opportunity to make public investment, financing it by debt? But the fiscal rules that we impose on ourselves make that very difficult. Shouldn't we blow up the fiscal rules, right? Make sure that public investment...
Gentlemen,
I want some controversy, right? I mean, no, I mean, shouldn't we make sure that this problem that you mentioned is or can be dealt with at least partially by public authorities, making public investment by issuing debt, not only at European level, but also at the national level. But we have tied our hands and we have been told verboten.
Paolo, you want to take the floor?
Yeah, my answer is yes. I agree I mean the core argument you advance. The idea of a surplus of saving, that is available for, in some way, financing investment. What's happened today is that this kind of saving is going to, this excess saving is going to be very much looking for the American financial, markets, because there the return. So what could be done? Certainly, the idea of having a more efficient, unified financial market could help, could be contribution. But I agree that should not be the, only kind of recipe or kind of the response. Because, what could be said, particularly if you look the transition in terms of climate change, together with digital and biotech, we're saying that this is going to have a long-term return. In other words, medium long-term. And the costs are going to be much more short run. This is the ideal condition to finance, this kind of transition by issuing debt, because it's also a way of redistributing over generation the burden of financing this transition, because quite a large part of this, benefit is going to be, not being able to, in some way, taken by the present or the current generation. But so I think, there is many reasons why this is a condition where, public investment financed by debt should be implemented. And I agree that the kind of rules for financial restraint today is an obstacle, as an impediment, because of course you should be flexible. You could be flexible in interpretation of this rule, but there's nothing to do. I mean, if we want, either we want, that national saving could be used to finance the transition in terms of climate and digital, or, we should be given some kind of room at national level. And today, for many countries in Europe, there is no room. And it's not only the high debt. So there is no doubt that the current, kind of rules, the fiscal rule, is an impediment. So I agree. There is a room for that, for financing national and Euro debt, because the kind of transition is very much producing costs that are in a short run and return at a medium long run. And, in terms of financing, it's very clear that what has been the compromise at the end of the fiscal rule are not been considering at all the idea of room. So I agree.
Okay, so let's do the following. Maybe for the next 5 minutes, if some of you want to come back to some of the points you made, ask an additional question, and then we will open the floor to Q&A from the audience.
Just to go to the audience first, and then we can come back in the last round.
You prefer that? What do you mean? First Q&A from the floor? Yeah, but that will be until the end, huh? Okay, fine. Let's do that. Okay, it's fine with me. I'm flexible. So we now open the floor for questions. So if you want to raise a question, you just raise your hand, you say who you are, and somebody will come with a microphone. Okay. Yes, please. There.
Thank you very much for your speeches. My name is Federico. I am a double degree student from Bocconi and LSE here at the European Institute in European and International Politics and Policy. I wanted to ask a question to Professor Padoan about a point that has been touched upon in pretty much all the speeches regarding investments in the green transition and specifically renewable energy. So when Trump was advocating for slashing all the climate policies by Biden, and the same has happened in the European Union with the European Green Deal. There were proposals to water it down, to repeal it, and so on and so forth. Leaders in the financial sector claim that policy consistency is at least as much as important as what the policy is, because you need policy consistency to develop a strategy that is going to unleash in a lot of years. So given the U-turn by Trump on Biden-era climate policies, and I mean the attempts in Europe that have been as successful, what's your position regarding this? So will banks follow the policy trend that has been set by Trump, or will they stick to their strategies and pursue renewable investments in renewable energy, although they will not be, how can I say, helped by institutions anymore? Thank you.
I take it.
Yeah, please.
Well, thanks for the question. What we're witnessing nowadays is that there is caution about the fact that green transition, which is not questioned per se, will be a smooth process. It will not be a smooth process. And maybe the policy community, not only the policy community, but also markets, should have realized early on that there was too much optimism on how this was going on. At the same time, saying that the green transition is wrong from a point of view of strategy, it would be a huge mistake, because it would simply say we have wasted all the resources we have investing in green technologies and whatever, but now we say, sorry, we cannot afford it, which is not true. This is basically an area in which, since we are facing a big structural change, I would see a role for quote-unquote industrial policies to direct investment and to support the private sector in doing so. So there is a chance that we use all the policy at our disposal in a way that is long-term, minimizing costs, including social costs, which is one of the elements of the transition. The ESG paradigm, which you're all familiar, I guess, with, includes environment, social, and governance. The three things must go together. And this is something which refers to public policy, industry, finance, consumers. So it's about reconsidering a strategy which itself is the right one.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
Good evening. Brunello Rosa, Rosa and Rubini, Associate, LSE and Bocconi University. A question on the digital euro, if I may.
As you know, this is actually a project that has been brought forward by two eminent Italians, Fabio Panetta and Piero Cipollone now, and is progressing fast. It seems to be, again, the only one unifying project that is going on at European level, because, as you mentioned, the Letta report and Draghi report are full of good recommendations, but we need to see whether they will be implemented or not, while the Digital Euro project is progressing fast, and I think likely so. So how is it that it seems that only on monetary matters, Europe seems to make huge progress, and all the other matters always lag behind? Thank you.
You want to respond
Yeah.
to this?
Yeah, I'm not sure that, it is absolutely true that in digitalization of euro, the European Central Bank has moved, in some way, not only fastly, but is targeting, in a very effective way, what are the goals be implemented. And there is a kind of quite a wide consensus behind, this strategy. I'm not so sure that, this is just to be used as an example where in the monetary area, is much easier or is much more effective way to achieve a kind of consensus, because, digital euro is also very important for another very major goal for the European currency, the internationalization of euro. That, as you know, was in some way, is especially in the light of the new world, the new geo-economic, and so is a very important instrument for a large area like Europe. Now, the internationalization of euro is very much linked to the same kind of problem that is the completion of monetary union. And from this point of view, in our book, we have a chapter about, the how many steps should be taken in order to complete the monetary unification. That is, is a monetary unification and is not in an economic and monetary unification. And the banking union is still, very far to be completed. The capital market union, we are saying that is still very far, to be completed. And this is our two major pillars also for the internationalization of the euro. In other words, the two are very much related. If you want to, you have to reinforce the completion of monetary and economic monetary union in order also to have chance of, widening the international use of the euro. And in this area, still, we are very far from having a kind of, I would say, wide consensus. In the capital market union, it's been almost 10 years that we are not, we have not been able to move, because there are quite a group of, large group of countries, over a small country, but they are strongly opposing, this kind of step. So I would say, yes, the digitalization of euro is an example in a positive term, but it's not at all, reflecting the many problems that are still, to be resolved, looking for a kind of cohesion and a unifying strategy in monetary area. So I don't see an exception in a monetary issue.
Can I add something on this? Of course, I fully agree with you, but what I've seen, the proposals that are now on the table with the digital euro, this is so incredible. This will lead to nowhere. I mean, so many restrictions. The amount that individuals can hold will be restricted. It will not be remunerated, while the central banks are remunerating the banks for holding exactly the same kind of deposit, right? They have received 4% Now they receive 2.75% on their deposit. So we will come out with digital euro, and we say, ECB will say, good news, you can now hold deposits at the central bank, 0 interest rate, and the banks get 2 or 3 or 4% interest rate. Who is willing to sell that to the public? Nobody. So I think this is a lost opportunity.
To maintain a banking system.
It has been captured by the banks,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
It has been captured by the banks, so it will lead nowhere.
Can I
That's my
add
view.
one point on that? Because it's interesting that the banks claim actually the opposite. Because they say that there will be a competition between
of
the
course.
banks and the central bank,
Yeah.
and the citizen will rather deposit with ECB than with any other commercial bank. But this is just to report
This is,
a
They
debate.
would, wouldn't they?
But
They would, wouldn't they?
yeah. Well, but I think this is just pro domo discourse, right? I mean, how can you sell a new thing where you say private agents will get a deposit at the ECB, will not be remunerated, and banks will be remunerated? This is, you cannot sell this.
It's not digital, you see.
Well, it's the same.
You can have an arm wrestle later.
Okay, yeah, next question. From this side here. Okay, yeah, and then you. Okay, let's first start with the students, right? And then, yeah.
I'll keep mine quick. My name's Finn. I'm studying European and International Politics and Policy here at the LSE. In this period of transition, there's obviously a lot of investment required. You've talked about some of the financing for that. Are cuts going to have to be made to welfare systems in member states in the foreseeable future to help make this transition happen?
Well, we go back to the point I was mentioning earlier on about the ESG story. We are facing a situation of huge and terrible trade-offs we have to cope with. Certainly, the welfare state needs to be maintained and possibly improved. We can see that examples of that continuously in the healthcare, in the unemployment support, in the education area, which to be addressed require investment, but also require possibly new ways of providing local public goods. I don't have an answer to your question, but I certainly agree that this is one of the reasons why Europe must make a big effort in providing at the same time growth to support and maintaining of the welfare system. But there are ways of doing that. Let's take the example of, I was mentioning earlier on, of migration. Migration is possibly one of the clear cases. We need to have the best possible conditions for migration to support domestic labor markets. I'm certainly thinking of my own country's situation where we badly need more workers. But at the same time, we have a domestic security problem with migrants. So this is symbolic of a situation. So my answer is certainly we don't have to cut. We have to reconsider and redesign.
Okay, can I answer? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Okay.
There's one other aspect of this to consider, which is that several European countries are aging very rapidly. The most obvious examples are Italy, Germany, Finland, so Poland. And what that does is to reduce the core of working age people who are generating the income and to increase the cohort of dependent people, particularly elderly dependent. And that's going to put intense pressure on welfare systems. There isn't an answer, as Pier Carlo has said, but it is a phenomenon that has to be addressed as part of these questions of transition.
And
Migration may be one answer.
And support and social unrest.
Yes.
Angelo? Just wait for the microphone.
Hello, everyone. Angelo Martelli, assistant professor at the LSE European Institute. So scale and competitiveness have been, targeted as the culprits here for the EU. And we have been, rightly so, and we have been lagging behind the US for a while. Now, but if one looks at productivity, and takes away the big tech in the US, actually the gap is narrower. So we are not that far. And then comes DeepSeek or comes electric vehicle. And one sees that China actually is doing it quicker and sometimes even better than the US. So, I mean, it is then Trump's recipe of protecting what they have in terms of big monopolies, the recipe that we should also adopt. And therefore, should Europe, in a way, then do what? Continue with an open economy and open trade, or should it actually lean a bit more towards a more protectionist approach? It's because, I mean, in the report by Draghi, he's talking in a critical way about competition, but actually that's what has allowed the EU not to have the big monopolies that also don't then promote innovation. So that's a bit my question.
Yeah, respond. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true that if we take competitiveness in terms of not so much, in relative prices, but competitiveness in terms of comparing productivity in Europe and in US, and we see that, productivity in Europe has been lagging behind over the past 10, 15 years, particularly in the Draghi report, but there are other many, a lot of evidence showing that the particular area where this lagging behind and this kind of gap has been crucial is in digital technology. There's no doubt about that. And digital technology, particularly in digital services, that, as we know, is a fundamental output of digitalization. When you put at disposal this kind of digital services that many times are complementary to manufacturing. They are not, an alternative. Why, Europe has been lagging behind, in digital area, and particularly, in this is, of course, there are many possible explanations, but there is no doubt that, the fragmentation of European markets, in particularly, this digital area, has been one of the main negative factors. Because, if you take even this kind of a sector like telecom, you see that in this area, we have been, going in exactly the opposite direction, the US and China. And particularly, we have been cultivating this kind of national or even local champions, in terms of firms. So there's no doubt that if we take, off this digital area on the rest of industry and manufacturing, Europe is exactly, is comparable in how is possible to, in some way to do positive steps in order to diminishing this gap. This is the crucial question today. The digital area, digitalization is important, not because it's a sector, but because this is a sector that is going to diffuse and is going to influence the rest of the production sector. In other words, AI is going to be fundamental as the digital technology in the first wave. So the crucial point is, this is not a sector that you could say, okay, but I am strong comparative advantage in another sector. No, this is crucial in order to implement this kind of diffusion. And for Europe, this is the key question today. And there's no doubt that, competition is a kind of a complex kind of tool, because on one hand is crucial in order to have a, kind of digitalization and diffusion of this technology. Philippe Aghion has been, showing in a marvelous model this complementarity between industrial policy and competition, that you should have both. Because, if you, so the point is, and I respond also what Lorenzo Codogna was saying before, but we need an industrial policy. Why we should supporting, I agree with you that industrial policy, is needed today for many reasons. One reason is that we are facing this kind of, structural change between relative price where, the ecological resources where the fossil fuel were considered, priceless, in a kind of different paradigm where we have to charge fossil fuels for the externality negative. So we need this intervention of the state. We cannot allow the market. The market has not been able to produce the incentive. But we should be very careful that industrial policy should be, in some way implemented, not in a traditional old style way, but very much taking into consideration the flexibility of intervention, the evaluation of intervention, the interaction with the private sector. I mean, all what is called in new industrial policy approach. This is crucial because if we go back into the idea that it's enough to pump money into, this is going to be very risky because at the end you're going to give money to the incumbent firms that don't need this kind of money. It's not going to. So this problem of how to implement a kind of better performance of the European country, European firms in digitalization is a crucial kind of issue, and Draghi report is offering many interesting kind of insight. The only thing I think is kind of undermining the role of competition in private sector, because it's very clear that you need both this kind of intervention in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the public investment. But what is crucial is how to create a business environment, competitive business environment, in order to create and diffuse this technology, because the major result is on diffusion of digital technology, and going to be on diffusion of AI. The Chinese now, kind of novelty showing that this AI model is going to be very cheap, is much less costly. It could be very well adapted to the auto sector, to the machinery. So from this point of view, I think the idea is in some way to be very careful about simply to say, in abstract terms, less competition, more industrial policy, more public money. This is going to be not the right recipe. So I agree with your kind of statement.
May I try to demystify a little bit digital technologies? You know what Robert Solow said about digital technologies? You see them everywhere except in productivity statistics, right? Since we have digital technologies, but we observe productivity growth declined almost everywhere.
Not in the US.
But also in the US, productivity growth has declined. I mean, it used to be 3 or 4%. It's now much lower. So this has happened everywhere. And the question is, why is that so? Well, because there are two aspects to digital technology. One is, that's right. One is what you say, and the other is computer games, Facebook, what have you, Twitters, that tend to distract you, that lead young people to read less, and as a result, destroy their human capital, accumulate whatever, young and old, accumulating all kinds of mental diseases because of isolation of these digital technologies. So it's not clear that it leads to more productivity.
But Solow made that kind of statement that is so quoted. But exactly 10 years, the next decade of Solow statement, the productivity in US has been jumping. Was a wave. If you see.
A few years,
No. Was the 90 was the era when we have the first wave of digitalization.
Yeah, that's right. For a couple of years, and then it has gone down also.
Not more than couple. At least 7 or 8 years.
Write a new chapter.
Yeah, a new chapter after the migration.
But you're right. You're right about the fact that there is the risk of emphasizing.
Yeah.
I agree.
There were online
We-
questions.
Paul-
Okay, can you formulate them?
Ha fatto quella selezione.
Need to- Oh,
Yeah.
An online question by Holly Atwell from Epico Klimal Innovation in Berlin. How do you see Germany reversing its course of economic demise, 2 consecutive years in decline, and returning to its former status as financial powerhouse of Europe?
Okay.
Well, it is a fact that the automotive industry has been facing the challenges of Chinese production, which someone said is even better than Western, so to speak, production. It is a fact that the automotive industry in Germany is much at the core of the growth engine in Germany and Europe as well. So if you put these things together, we have to deal with big facts. How do we revert this? Should we try to regain competitiveness in green vehicles, or should we look at new sectors? Frankly, I'm not sure I'm seeing a clear statement made by the German authorities, but the dimension of this situation is such that we need a European response and look at ways of providing growth in new sectors. One point I was adding to the interesting discussion on productivity is that to some extent AI is similar to a general purpose technology like electricity, like steam engine, which to my knowledge takes a long time to be fully diffused in the system. And once it takes that, then possibly we have to review the figures. So Paul, we will be back here with new evidence.
Okay, so let's plan a next session here. Last question is by Jan, and then we will close this meeting.
Well, this is more an answer to the question from Berlin, which is Germany is the only country in Europe still to use the fax machine. And the reason for this is that Germany has both rules and a lack of infrastructure that's made it difficult for it to move into the current electronic era. The answer in Germany is relaxation of the fiscal rules. They've had the debt brake, the Schuldenbremse, for a long time, and even the CDU is now saying, no, it's time we moved on to a more relaxed fiscal position.
Great. The last word is for Simona.
Last word, so maybe I should avoid it. I agree with Ian that I think relaxation of fiscal rule is a good way forward for Germany. I got the weird feeling that Europe will be investing a lot in defense, which is the kind of activity manufacturing that Germany can also do, but rearming Germany, I'm not sure is actually the best way to get out of this. But I got the very weird feeling that in the very near future, this will be what they will do.
I think Tony will have the last word.
No, I would just like to remind everyone of what Pier Carlo said sort of halfway through, which was the number one issue is security. I mean, I endorse that 100%. It is security and the defense of Europe, and we need to really get our skates on that point.
Okay, good. I think this comes to an end. I'm very grateful to this panel for having produced these enlightening ideas and for the discussion we have had by the audience. So let me thank in particular the 2 writers of that book that we are all eager to read.